Going to be in Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 24. A couple of miracles away from home for Jesus. You might remember in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus sends out the 12 and tells them, I don't want you to go to the Gentiles. Only go to the lost of the house of Israel. That's what Matthew tells us. In Mark, we don't have that phrase. We just have go and preach and don't take extra sandals, don't take an extra cloak, that part of it. But he doesn't mention that it's only for the Jews, don't go to the Gentiles. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to why Mark didn't record that part of the statement? He's writing mainly to Gentiles. So instead of saying, Jesus liked the Jews more, he just says that they were told to shake the dust off their feet if the town didn't receive them. He doesn't go into the detail that Jesus said, don't go to the Gentiles, only go to the Jews. Over in Matthew 11, let's run over there real quick, kind of hold where you are. Jesus began to denounce the towns in which most of his miracles had been performed because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented a long time ago in sackcloth and ashes. I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than it will be for you. And then he gets on Capernaum, which was kind of hometown where they were basing their ministry at the time. So, said all that to say this, Jesus is about to go up the coastline into Syrophoenicia, which was about as far north, a little farther north than you could go and still be in Israel. And it was inhabited by mainly Gentile folks. So when Jesus goes up there, he goes for a reason. He's ready to get away from the crowds. He's ready to be not really on vacation, but to take a break with his disciples. And so he heads for a region that's not fully inhabited by Israelites. Tyre and Sidon currently are in Lebanon. There was reading a little bit about Tyre, I think it was, that there's still a Christian quarter. Everybody in the world, when they conquered Jerusalem back and forth, back during the Dark Ages, Tyre was in the same boat. The Crusaders owned it for a few years. The Islamic people came in and defeated them and took it back. The Greeks had it for a while. The Romans had it for a while. So it's been under a lot of different auspices, but they are not typically Israeli people, and they're not typically Jewish or Jewish religionists. So Jesus takes a break from being among his own people. And he goes up there, and then later on he says, well, if the people in my hometown had responded like I think Tyre and Sidon would have responded, then things would have been better. All right, verse 24 of chapter 7. Jesus left that place and he went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not keep his presence a secret. So even that far away from home, they're a couple of days north of Nazareth at this point. They're not anywhere close to being in their own neighborhood. He still couldn't keep it a secret. So people even in the Gentile regions had heard of him, knew who he was, and perhaps he had already done some miracles in this region. The other place he was among the Gentiles, what we call the Decapolis, is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So it's farther inland and across to the east from where he lived. This is north and west of where Jesus grew up. So don't know why they knew so much about him, but they did, and they didn't want him to be left alone. Verse 25, in fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. Let first the children eat all they want, he told her, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, even in Mark, we have the words of Jesus here. And what's Jesus telling her? Who are the children? The Jews. And who are the dogs? The Gentiles. And this was not uncommon language for Jews to refer to foreigners and non-Jews as dogs. It doesn't sound nice to us, but that was their mindset. There were Jews and there was everybody else. And so Jesus says, it wouldn't be right for me to give you what really belongs to the Jewish people. The woman responded, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. It's one of the most famous passages, at least in my mind, in all the Gospels. This woman knew exactly the right thing to say. She didn't try to fight him on the issue. She didn't try to be ugly. She didn't say, how can you talk to me like that? She said, well, okay, but even if that's true, don't you think that maybe you could do something even for the dogs? If that's who I am, then that's who I am. But my daughter needs help. Now, how many of us would swallow our pride on our own behalf compared to how many of us would swallow our pride for our kids, right? If you're going to help my kid, I'm a little quicker to swallow my pride than if it's just about me, right? So those of us who have daughters, you're going to do what you can to make sure that they are cared for. So she says, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And so Jesus responds, for such a reply you may go, the demon has left your daughter. And so she went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Now this is another miracle of what we call remote. Jesus didn't go home with her. He never saw the little girl physically. He just told her, your daughter's fine, go home. What other miracle of remote can you think of from Jesus?
How about the man that came to ask for a son?
There you go. We have a commander in the Roman army, and he comes to Jesus and says, my son is sick, and I need you to heal him. And Jesus says, well, okay, I'll go with you. And the guy says, oh no, I'm not worthy to have you come into my house. He says, I understand how authority works. I say to this guy, go, and he goes. And I say to this guy, go, and he goes. When I make a command, they do what I tell them to do. And Jesus was like, oh, okay, well, then I'll just make the command. And he says, your son's better. And he goes home, and he's all taken care of. On another occasion, they're on the way to heal somebody, and the servants show up and say, well, just leave him alone. He's already dead. Oh, no, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be okay. So Jesus was always in control, even when he wasn't immediately present at the bedside of the ones who were sick. And so this woman, he tells her the good news. Your daughter is well, and she goes home and finds out that sure enough, the demon has left her daughter, and her daughter's lying in the bed and is comfortable and cured. I think one of the things Mark wants us to do, or wants us to see, is when he draws the difference between a demon-possessed person and a person who's been healed from their demon possession. There's always that final little snippet that they're sitting, they're clothed, they're in their right mind, they're comfortable, right? You remember the guy that had the legion? The end of the story is the people come out from the Decapolis and they find him sitting there, and he is clothed and he's in his right mind. And he's comfortable. So the little girl, we don't get details on what her demon might have done to her, but the demon is gone and she no longer has that problem. Do you remember some of the things that demons did to people in Scripture? Threw them in the fire, right? The one man had a son whose demon was very similar to epilepsy, had those kinds of symptoms, that the son would just have fits. The demon would throw him into the water. The demon would throw him into the fire, trying to destroy the physical host. The man that was in the tombs cut himself with rocks. So there's nothing good going to happen by being infested by demons. But when Jesus gets hold of the demons and casts them out, then there's peace and there's tranquility for whoever was invaded by the spirits. Another interesting thing about this, Jesus doesn't have a conversation with these demons. Right? The demons that were in the guy in Gennesaret, he talks to them. They negotiate on where they're going to go if he casts them out of the man. Well, let us go into the pigs. And Jesus says, well, okay, we'll make that deal. Puts them into the pigs, and then they destroy the host. So they do, what you would expect them to do. They hurt the host that they're living in. This little girl, Jesus never meets her and never sees the demons, never talks to the demons face to face. How does he cast out the demons? Same way he does anything else. He has the power to say, this is the way it is, and then it's done. Imagine the surprise of the demon when all of a sudden, Jesus isn't even there, and oops, I can't stay here anymore. And he gets cast out from the little girl. So lots of neat things going on in that one. Verse 31, we talk about another guy from that region. He's moving on to the east. So he's back in that area around Gennesaret where he cast out the demons from the guy who had the legion, and into the Decapolis area where, again, lots of Gentiles. But these are folks that probably Jesus and several of his disciples had done business with. All right? They did business in the Decapolis. It was right on the other side of the lake. So they were not Jews, but they were people that lived close enough to the Jewish population that they did business with them. Maybe somewhat similar to the way that things were prior to October of last year, when the terrorists went into Israel and started this fight. There were checkpoints and gates, and people who lived in Palestine passed over into Israel to work. And so there were lots of folks that had jobs who came up through the checkpoints and would check in and be in Israel all day, and then they would check out and go back home at night. Same thing is true in Gaza. Same thing was true in the Golan Heights. Just security was in place, but there were, people that were able to move about freely. So this hasn't just hurt Israel's economy, Israel's people. There were a lot of people who were on the up and up that have lost jobs and lost the freedom to go back and forth and be part of the Israeli economy because the leaders in their home country decided to do what they did. And so lots and lots of folks are in bad shape. So anyway, what I'm saying is that there's always been people that were not Jewish that did business with the Jews. Now, depending on how conservative you were, it kind of dictated to how much you could be with them. You could do business with them, but you couldn't share a meal with them. You could do business with them, but you'd never go into their house. All of those kinds of things were in place, but there were people on both sides of the border that did business with one another, even though they weren't of the same ethnicity. All right, so verse 31, Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre, and he went through Sidon, which is a little north and west, and then he makes a loop and goes down to the Sea of Galilee into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. Anybody done enough counseling or work with people that are hearing impaired or speech impaired? That's never been in my line of business. Yes, ma'am?
I worked with kids.
Yeah, and kids who lose their hearing later, do they retain their speech patterns for a while and then gradually goes away? It doesn't tell us how long this guy's been suffering, but it does say he was deaf and could hardly talk. So it's possible that he at one time had some level of hearing and was able to develop some speech, but then at this time it seems like he's completely deaf and unable to communicate very well. So that's a tough situation to be in. They did not have a universal sign language in those days, so you couldn't just treat them that way. They didn't have surgeries. They didn't have the special hearing aids that they have now. Some of the new stuff is just amazing, that they tie in to the auditory nerves and kind of bypass the whole hearing apparatus and just go straight into the brain with sound. It's just bizarre, amazing that people are able to do that kind of thing. when our nieces and nephews were little bitty, some of them had to have tubes, right? And so, one day they would have so much pressure in their ears they couldn't hear at all, and then those tubes would relieve some of that pressure, and they'd be able to function a little bit better. But it affected the way that they spoke. If you can't hear language, it's difficult to mimic it. It's difficult to speak and to learn how to talk. So he took him aside, away from the crowd. So again, we have kind of a secretive approach. When he healed the little girl who had died, he takes just the mom and dad and Peter and John, right? They go off by themselves to heal the girl, to raise her from the dead. So he's not always doing these things right out in the middle of everybody. He does some of them very quietly and aside. So he takes him aside, away from the crowd. And then Jesus does two odd things, right? First of all, he puts his fingers in the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. Some of the translations are a little more specific. He touched the man's tongue with the spittle. Okay? We have a guy in John 9 who is healed of blindness, been blind all of his life. How does Jesus heal that guy? Spits on the ground and makes mud, smears the mud in his eye sockets and says, hey, go wash this out. And the guy comes back seeing. So stuff that's a little out there. When Jesus, he doesn't have to try. The woman just touches the hem of his garment and she's healed. The woman says, my daughter has a demon. And he goes, well, go home. She doesn't have a demon anymore. But this guy gets the full physical treatment, puts his fingers in his ear, spits and touches his tongue. He looked up into heaven and with a deep sigh said, Ephatha. Ephatha. Which means be open. So Mark gives us the translation. Did you notice that he gets even more specific, right? When he healed the little girl, he says to the little girl, Talitha kum, little girl, get up. Here, he doesn't just say something to the guy. He looks up into heaven and he moans, he sighs deeply and says, Ephatha. And the guy's opened up. Everything opens and he's able to communicate. So he's not, and it doesn't go through phases. So one of the things about Jesus' miracles that's the most wonderful, when he heals somebody, they don't get a little bit better, and then he says, come back to me in a week, and we'll give you some more, and let me lay hands on you a few more times, and we'll be there. Now, lay hands on them one time, and not just the hearing is fixed, but the speech impediment is fixed. All of a sudden, he can speak plainly. So Jesus heals the whole individual. Every problem he's got is taken care of all at once. Okay, this is the second one of the ipsissima verbas, the very words of Jesus that we get. Pop quiz, what's the third one? Give you a hint, it's at the very end, during Jesus' crucifixion. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? So, Mark gives us three really amazing statements of Jesus and their translations. And for those of you guys that do devotionals occasionally, especially if you do one that's not here, since everybody will all have already heard it, but give them 2 weeks, they'll forget. The three things that Jesus says, the first two, he tells the young girl, don't tell anybody. Here he's going to tell the man, don't tell anybody. But when he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, we're supposed to tell everybody because he died on the cross. So that makes a good little 3-point devotional. So Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. Right? So think back to Matthew, and he says if the signs had been done in Tyre and Sidon that have been done in you, they would have repented a long time ago. So that general vicinity, the Gentiles, the over there folks, if I had done the kind of miracles for them that I did for you, they would have repented. Well, here's at least a little snippet of how these people responded when Jesus did these miracles for them. They just kept talking about it. The people were overwhelmed. They were in amazement. So there's Mark's favorite word. They were all amazed. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, we've already had a couple of places where folks say he even does this or that. He rebukes the demons and they listen to him. And this group says, well, he even is able to do the hearing impaired and those who cannot speak. He's able to fix that as well. So we get kind of a list of things that he can even do that as we go through the Gospel of Mark. He keeps us up to date on all the things that Jesus is capable of doing. Now, we won't get into chapter 8. We have another feeding of a large group of people in chapter 8, so we'll save that, Lord willing, for next week. If anybody have any questions or thoughts about either of these miracles?